Hello, listeners. You just tuned in to the NetSuite podcast. I'm your host, Kendall Fisher, and this episode brings forth hot button topic, the Wayfair decision, and subsequent e-commerce tax laws. We're joined by Oracle NetSuite's Senior Associate Content Manager and in-house expert on the discussion, Ian McHugh. He breaks down the Supreme Court's ruling in the Wayfair decision, what the decision means for your company, and how to ensure you're meeting all regulations across the states in which you do business. Make sure you stay tuned because McHugh provides some solid insight and advice. All of that coming up next.
You're listening to the NetSuite podcast, where we discuss what's happening within NetSuite, why we're doing it, and where we're heading in the future. We'll dive into the details about the software and the people at NetSuite who are behind all the moving parts. We'll also feature customer growth stories, discussing the ups and downs of running a company and how one integrated system can help your business continue to scale.
Before we get into this episode about the Wayfair decision with Ian McHugh, I want to thank our sponsors over at Hint. If you don't know about Hint yet, the brand is all about making the everyday more enjoyable, starting with water. Kara Golden, Hint's founder, needed a way to drink more water, but wanted flavor without all those extra sugars and sweeteners that come in most drinks. So she created Hint Water. It has just a hint of flavor from real fruit essences without any of those added sugars or sweeteners. But why don't you go check it out yourself? You can go to hint.co/welcome to get 30% off your first purchase right now. Hi, Ian. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the NetSuite podcast.
Hey, Kendall, how's it going?
It's going well. We are currently in Denver, which is very exciting. I've only been here once before, so I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, on a beautiful day.
32
it's
degrees.
It's gray outside. Yeah. It snowed last night.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect, spring weather.
So. Exactly. Now, as I told our listeners in the intro to this podcast, you are a tax expert here at Oracle NetSuite, and you're going to help us break down the Wayfair decision, how that's impacting businesses, and what NetSuite is doing to help. So let's go all the way back to the beginning before this decision, which we will get into in a bit. But what did sales tax actually look like for remote sellers before all of this?
Yeah, so it really kind of starts, or the modern history, you could say, starts back in 1992. The Supreme Court handled a case called Quill Corporation versus North Dakota. And Quill Corporation was a business that had, I think they sold office supplies and they also licensed software. And so they were selling software on floppy disks because, again, this is 1992, a little bit different time than where we are right now. And they were selling floppy disks to a company in North Dakota. And North Dakota was saying, even though Quill Corporation is not based here in North Dakota, we think you should be charging tax and paying tax to us, remitting tax to us because you're selling into our state. And that decision eventually went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled that no, actually, they don't have a legal obligation to collect tax. And they use the Interstate Commerce Clause, which is something that goes back, hundreds of years about how the government doesn't basically want to get in the way of sales or trade between states or internationally as well. And so they were saying, well, if we have to do this for every company that sells into 50 different states, then, this is just going to be a big mess. And we're going to be kind of handicapping these companies from growing and from expanding into those different states. But, an important thing to note here, Quill was mostly a mail order company from what I know. So a very different business model than what we would see, almost 20 years later, or not quite 20 years, but, 15 plus years later with the Wayfair decision. So it's just such a different time. And mail order, was never even close to as big as e-commerce is now. I mean, yes, it was significant, but it still was just a fraction of what you see with e-commerce today. So I think that affected the court's decision as well, that this was, a relatively small subset of the economy. But that decision pretty much stood up until last year. So it did have a pretty lasting impact, even though it was such a long time ago, especially not just when you think about years, but when you think about how much retail and the selling of goods has changed since 1992.
Yeah. Other than the sale of floppy disks. Can you kind of explain why Quill is out of date and what problems it was causing?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, like we've kind of alluded to here, e-commerce has absolutely exploded. It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry on a global scale, and it's in the hundreds of billions in the US alone. And that's just a huge amount of money and a huge amount of orders, huge amount of sales. We all know of, the Amazons and the other big companies out there. Obviously, all your brick and mortar retailers like Target and Walmart have websites that do a ton of business, but it's all those niche companies that maybe you've ordered from once or twice. There's thousands of them out there, as well as the kind of mid-size companies and those big players. And it's just such a large amount of business happening online. And these states were essentially saying, this is just not fair because less and less money is going to brick and mortar stores, which is where they're typically getting this tax money when it comes to sales. And so if we can't get money, or we can't get nearly as much money as we used to from our brick and mortar sales because so much of it is moving online, how is this going to work out for us? And obviously they need that tax money for all the things that state governments do, roads, schools, a litany of things. But they felt like they needed funding for that, and we have the population growing as well, so they probably need tax dollars more than ever before. But yeah, it was essentially just we're missing out on a ton of revenue. I mean, billions of dollars on a national scale, and depending on the state, could definitely be hundreds of millions, if not even more, in some of the biggest states out there with the most consumers. But yeah, you could just see how this was kind of a budding issue. We did see some companies like Amazon start to charge sales tax, even though they weren't required to. In 2017, Amazon started collecting sales tax in the 45 states that have it. Just remember that Alaska, Delaware, Montana, New Hampshire, and Oregon don't have sales tax, whether it's in stores or online. They don't do it. They collect money in other ways. But Amazon started charging sales tax in the 45 other states, I think basically just to try to safeguard themselves a little bit and make sure they weren't going to potentially cause really big issues for themselves down the line, or at least minimize those issues by trying to get ahead of the gate a little bit. And some states did kind of implement, creative laws that were supposed to tax e-commerce sales. Some companies followed them, some don't, from what I understand. But they were trying to chip away at this problem a little bit and get whatever money they could. So there were, I would say, probably 10 plus states that implemented some kind of law, typically in the last 5 to 10 years, to try to collect sales tax in their state. But I don't think that was hugely effective. And when the Supreme Court was saying, Quill is still the standard here, I think companies were just saying, okay, well then we don't really need to do this.
So Amazon, we just think that they're trying to get ahead of the game a little bit. They obviously could foresee this coming a while back, 2017 at least, 2 years back. Is there any other reasoning behind that we're aware of?
I think they were maybe reading the tea leaves a little bit. I do think there were people who were still surprised by the Wayfair decision, but so, it wasn't like a sure thing that the Supreme Court was going to rule in favor of the states. But I think they were just trying to play it safe. And I think there might have been a handful of other really big retailers who kind of had a similar approach of let's just, be safe now. And if it turns out to not be an issue, once this thing gets to the Supreme Court and we get a decision, then we can stop doing it. But yeah, I think they just were getting a lot of pushback from the more traditional retailers who do have to charge these taxes because, we have to realize that it's really an advantage for a business if they don't have to charge sales tax, especially if you're making a really large purchase.
Right.
If you're buying something for $3,000, you could be saving hundreds of dollars by buying it online as opposed to in a store, just simply by the fact that you don't have to pay sales tax.
Right.
So that's a competitive issue too with the brick and mortar stores. So.
And it goes back into the full circle. If it's a competitive issue for brick and mortar stores and therefore they're closing down or they're not opening or whatever it may be, then it goes back to, where the states are losing taxes on the things that they need to, and the quotas they need to fulfill for their own, like you said, roads, education, so on and so forth.
Right. And they're already fighting an uphill battle, the brick and mortar, more traditional stores, and then to kind of have that as yet another obstacle for them is a pretty big issue. So you could see why they were unhappy.
Right. Okay, so tell me about the South Dakota versus Wayfair case. What's it all about and how did it reach the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so this was, one of many challenges the Supreme Court got over the years related to e-commerce sales tax because, again, they hadn't really addressed this issue since 1992. It's a long time to go in between decisions, and the Supreme Court is very picky with the cases they accept. So I know it moved through a couple different state courts, and then I believe the state Supreme Court in South Dakota and an appeals court for the region at some point eventually worked its way up to the Supreme Court. I think that was in 2017, the year before they actually made the decision that the Supreme Court accepted it either in late 2017, early 2018. And it was actually a couple companies. So there was Wayfair, and then there was also a company called Newegg that sells a lot of computer parts, you might say, and kind of electronics type stuff. And then the third company that was part of the case against South Dakota was Overstock.com, which is another big retailer. It's been around for a pretty long time. So Wayfair is, the company that pretty much, it's the one named in the case, and it's the one that people refer to this case as, but there were actually three companies that were challenging a South Dakota law. And the South Dakota law said if you had over $100,000 in revenue generated in that state or 200 different transactions. So either of those thresholds, if either of those were met with customers in the state of South Dakota, then at that point you had to start charging sales tax, collecting it, and then remitting it, which basically just means sending it back to the state so the local or state government can get that money back. So they had these clear thresholds. I think South Dakota even knew when they did this, they could be stirring the pot a little bit and that there would surely be legal challenges and maybe, it would be the case, if you will, that will make it to the Supreme Court. But, it was kind of a way to force the issue a bit, if nothing else, that, hey, we're going to try to do something and see where it goes because we basically aren't going to accept the status quo right now.
Right. The Dakotas, man, in both of these cases.
Yeah, like some of the smallest states in the U.S. And they're involved in both of these landmark decisions.
So what was the decision for South Dakota versus Wayfair?
Yeah, so the court, ruled in favor of the state of South Dakota, essentially saying, it's fair to have a law like this. You can impose these transaction thresholds and then start charging sales tax. And, I guess most importantly is that they overturned the Quill decision, which was that 92 ruling, and said it's quote unquote unsound and incorrect. So, their argument was essentially something that I think will make sense to all of us, which is e-commerce didn't really even exist in 1992. I think it had been invented maybe, but it was, no one was really using it. And the mail order industry was so small compared to e-commerce. The world has changed so much since then. We have so many goods going to customers in so many different states and such a large value of products moving across states that, we kind of need to do something here. So I think the one caveat that some of the justices had, or the one issue that was raised was, will this be a hurdle for small businesses who now have to work with potentially very complex web of laws, which is exactly what we've seen develop in less than a year since that decision last June. But that was, I think, the one kind of major resistance point is, are we going to put undue burden, if you will, on these small businesses that are now going to have to comply with all these laws they didn't really have to worry about before?
And was the thoughts like, well, for the majority, it's bigger businesses, or what was the thought in that?
I think it was just, we have to do something.
Yeah.
And this is a fairly decent solution of having these thresholds, which, the $100,000 is pretty significant, especially in a state like South Dakota, which I think has a population of under 1 million people or around 1 million people.
Yeah.
But a lot of much, much bigger states have adopted these same rules as a state law. And that's where you can start to see $100,000 not being that much, or 200 transactions could be really minimal in any state.
Right.
Especially if you sell something that's kind of on the cheaper side, it's really just a couple $1,000s. If your average product order is like $10 or $15, some states have adopted a strictly financial or revenue-based number and not have that transaction limit, I think in part because of that reason. But 200 transactions, I would say, is much more of a barrier for a lot of smaller to mid-sized companies than the $100,000.
Yeah. So what other states did jump on board?
I mean, almost all of them were. By my count, we're up to 40 states. Again, 45 have sales tax, so 40 out of 45 plus DC. So 41 if you want to include that as a state. And it's, it really came so quick. Some of these laws went into effect, even before the Supreme Court decision, but they weren't enforceable before then.
Right.
Some states, have since updated their laws so that they are more in line with what the Supreme Court ruled. But some of these laws also went into effect on July 1st, which was like 10 days after the decision, roughly. And it wasn't like they just got the wheels turning when that Supreme Court decision happened. They'd already been working toward it and then were, able to enforce it because of the Supreme Court decision on July 1st.
So a lot of these, a lot of states were at the state level, we were working at these individual kind of laws being put into place. But now that it's at the federal level, essentially at the Supreme Court level, it's countrywide.
It's not so much that the Supreme Court said like nationally, these thresholds are okay. It's more like they said it's okay to have laws like this. And then states kind of took that and ran with it and said, okay, well then we're going to implement this law. We're going to implement that law. There's still no national or federal law that applies to all 50 states. A lot of states have the same law as South Dakota, I think just because it was a good model.
Yeah.
I'd say I think it's about 2/3 of the 40 states have the same law as South Dakota, but I think that's just learning from them. It wasn't like they had to choose that number or the Supreme Court was like, this is the rule for everyone. They just said this is, constitutional. We're okay with them having a law like this, and other states followed suit.
Want to help save the planet? Here's an idea. Go nude. Unfortunately, not wearing clothes isn't realistic for most of us, but buying sustainable clothing is. Here's Gordon Seabury, CEO of Toad & Co.
Few know that garment production can generate tremendous pollution. So that's why we're hellbent on offering cleaner, sustainably made clothing that's stylish and long-lasting. But that's only half the battle at Toad & Co. When it comes to hitting our business goals, we've learned to focus on what we're good at and seek partners for other areas of expertise. So when it came to ensuring a consistent customer experience across all sales channels and knowing what was going on with all aspects of our business, we chose NetSuite by Oracle. They know business systems, we know eco-friendly clothes, a perfect match.
From accounting and finance to commerce and human resources, NetSuite is the #1 business system to help you simply manage your business. Right now, go to netsuite.com/toad to get your free guide, Crushing the 5 Barriers to Growth. That's netsuite.com/toad for your free guide and to hear Gordon bear all on Toad & Co.'s growth story.
What about, so like South Dakota set, the precedents, and that's why I asked, because obviously I did a lot of research on this and I saw how many states were at the, similar thresholds. What about like a New York? Because that's completely different than a South Dakota.
Right. So New York has a law of $300,000 in revenue it's $300,000 in revenue and 100 transactions. So definitely a bit higher of a barrier because you need to hit both of those limits. So, that's going to help companies out a little bit. But California, the most populated state in the country, has the same law as South Dakota, $100,000 or 200 transactions. And that law just went into effect on April 1st, beginning of this month. You could see why that could be such a big impediment for so many companies because California, depending on what you're selling, but just sheerly based on the population, has so many customers that a lot of businesses are going to hit that threshold, and that's true in a lot of these states. So that's where some of the bigger issues come up. Is this really like a fair threshold to have, or should we be basing it more on population and the customer base there and stuff like that?
So I want to just like round this up kind of a little bit in terms of, so what would you say are the big factors that help South Dakota win the case? And I also want to ask about how this actually is impacting small businesses today. Because what about the businesses that are under the threshold?
Sure. So in terms of why South Dakota won the case, I mean, the biggest thing I think is something we already touched on, which is just the fact that e-commerce sales have absolutely skyrocketed. They account for about 15% of all retail right now, which might be less than you think, but retail is so huge that's a tremendous amount of money. Right. And it continues to grow year over year on a pretty steady basis, even though we're maybe past, the biggest growth point. It's still continuously sucking up a bigger and bigger share of retail. And, based on one study that was done, I think kind of in favor of the state of South Dakota, or something I should say that South Dakota used as evidence in its case, was that the 50 states were losing about $13 billion in taxes. And I actually saw another estimate that was in the 20 billion range. So, I mean, 13, if anything, is on the low end.
Yeah.
And some of those states are losing a lot more money than others, like California compared to South Dakota. California is losing a lot more money because of the number of goods sold into their state and the amount of money, that those goods are worth. But that's the biggest thing, I think, is just we can't ignore this problem anymore. It's not fair to brick and mortar stores, and it's not fair to these states to be missing out on so much money when e-commerce has taken off the way it has. And then I think the second thing was that South Dakota did have some kind of threshold here that, at least in theory, would protect your really small businesses who might not have the capacity to comply with these laws. Because, as we'll get into later, there's a lot of things you need to do to get in line with these laws. And so if it's like a family business with a couple people and a tiny office, or they just work out of their house, it might not be realistic for them. And they might even say, we're just going to shut our doors. Like, this isn't worth dealing with.
Right.
We don't make that much money from this anyway. And this is going to cut those profits even more. So what's the point? So I think that was a key part of it. Maybe something the Supreme Court didn't account for, or something that's become an issue since their decision, is that much bigger states are adopting the same thresholds, so that it could be more of a barrier to some very small businesses. So
got it. So you alluded to it earlier, but what do these laws look like now?
Yeah, so we're up to 40 states, as I mentioned,
right,
and a couple other states. There's only 5 left that have sales tax and don't have one of these laws yet. A couple of those states have active legislation. It just hasn't passed through the state government fully yet. But they run the gamut a little bit. A lot of them are $100,000 or 200 transactions. But for example, Alabama is just $250,000, no transaction limit. Seems a little more fair for a state that's kind of probably in the middle of the pack in the U.S. And Massachusetts is probably has one of the highest bars. It's $500,000 and 100 transactions. So even if you're selling $500,000 worth of goods because you have a really expensive product, like maybe a really expensive software product or something, if you're not hitting 100 transactions, you're still not going to be responsible for sales tax there. And if you are hitting 100 transactions, but you're only selling $100,000 worth of goods, you're fine too, So
that's why? Why would Massachusetts set that threshold? You know what I mean? Do we have any insight into does geography matter? Does population matter? I guess it would be the business into the state, but why would Massachusetts set that the way that it did?
I think it's just state governments handling it as they see most appropriate. And some might be doing this trying to think ahead a little bit and saying maybe someone's gonna win some kind of case here, maybe not at the Supreme Court level, but something a little lower that says it's really not fair for California to be saying with 200 transactions, I should be collecting sales tax there. So maybe they're trying to do that a little bit. Also, they could be trying to appeal to small businesses a little bit more. I don't know if that plays much of a role here, but it's one potential thing. I think different state governments are really just approaching it in different ways based on what they deem the most appropriate. But on the other hand, I guess some states are taking the approach of let's just get as much money out of this as we can.
Right.
And if something changes, we'll adapt to it. But
right.
For now, let's, get what we can.
So how does a business know if it should be collecting e-commerce sales tax in a current state?
Yeah. So, for most businesses, even your smaller businesses, if you have a significant amount of revenue and sell on a national scale or into, a significant number of states, you really do need to get some kind of expert help because it's just way too complicated. Typically, a tax attorney or a tax expert who usually has a law degree and is a practicing attorney is your best bet because they can really take, a deep look at your transactions, your finances, all your reporting, and figure out, first of all, where do you have a physical nexus? Because some people have a physical nexus without realizing it. And a physical nexus was the standard set back in that Quill decision.
Right.
For example, in some cases, if you have like a contract employee in a state, that could give you physical nexus there. If you're keeping inventory in a state, that can give you physical nexus there. People might not be thinking of those things because they say, well, we don't have an office there and we don't have a full-time employee there and we don't have a warehouse there. So clearly we don't have physical nexus, but it really gets a lot more cloudy than that. So that's kind of the physical nexus thing is really entirely separate from the Wayfair decision. Like, it's something that's been around for a long time, but still something that you should probably be aware of first before you even dig into this economic nexus, which is what the Wayfair decision established. But after that, you can try to figure out, with the help again of the expert, in which states you do meet these thresholds to figure out where you're going to be responsible for taxes from your e-commerce sales. And that's probably going to be a pretty significant process. But again, an expert is going to know how to do this. They do this for a lot of companies, and they'll know the best way to kind of figure this out relatively quickly. And then after that, you actually want to prioritize the states in which you are responsible for taxes, because some states are more aggressive about collecting this money than others. And also, if you're selling $10 million worth of stuff into California, they're going to care more than Utah when you sell $800,000 worth of stuff into Utah. So you need to prioritize them a little bit. And that's the only way, I think, to really make it kind of attainable. And then once you kind of have that figured out, you have to get some sort of solution. And obviously, it's only possible to really have insight into all this information, whether it's orders or revenue by state, with some sort of, accounting solution, ERP, whatever, some sort of centralized point of data that's going to have all this information. Otherwise, how are you even going to know if you're meeting the thresholds in these states? It's the only way to make it feasible.
Yeah. Is this something that we're tracking within NetSuite?
Yeah. I mean, NetSuite is one of those accounting systems or ERPs that can take all this data, put it in one place, and then something that you and your tax expert can go through to figure out where you are responsible for taxes. But bottom line is, you need some sort of record keeping system, or else you're going to have no idea whether you sold $100,000 worth of stuff into South Dakota. So.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so what should retailers be tracking? I mean, this is a lot of data to be aware of. What should they be tracking?
Yeah, I mean, I think they have to pay attention to the news a little bit and figure out states that are implementing laws. I mean, there's laws that are going into effect later in 2019. There's a couple going into effect in July. I mean, they've been really rolling out with multiple states per month. So this is something that's really moving with a lot of speed.
Yeah.
And even if it's not someone internally keeping an eye on it, maybe you're going to have to pay, a consultant or a tax expert, at least for a limited period of time, to kind of keep you up to date with things. Because not only do they maybe have time or more of the focus to be paying attention to these things, but they're also going to know a lot more what they mean for you than you will, in terms of, okay, well, this law, only affects this certain subset of goods, so you guys don't need to worry about it right now. But it's so complicated. There's so many facets to this that I think you, in most cases, need professional help, at least temporarily, to kind of find your way a little bit.
What happens if you're unaware of the changes and you've been, meeting the threshold or going above the threshold and you're not paying the taxes that you're supposed to be paying?
Yeah, we don't have too much evidence yet of states going back to try to get back taxes based on these new laws. But again, they're very new. The oldest ones are just over a year old for the most part, and they weren't enforceable until June of last year, June of 2018. So yes, maybe for now, or I kind of think the clock is ticking on how long you can claim negligence, or I didn't know, I wasn't aware. And I'm sure that's honest in some cases that they really weren't aware, but at some points the states are going to say, well, these are the laws, you're not following them, we need your money, we're counting on this.
Yeah.
And that's kind of that. So I do expect them to come looking for money owed at some point, saying, it's been 2 years or a year and a half since we enforced this law. We haven't gotten $1 from you, and we're pretty sure you're exceeding this threshold. So.
Right. So how does this impact, going back to what we were talking about earlier and the reason all of this has kind of come to fruition, how does this impact brick and mortar stores?
I mean, ultimately, I think it's a win for them. I think if you asked a person who was in that business, someone who ran a brick and mortar store, they would certainly be happy that it turned out this way. I don't think it's going to slow down e-commerce in a big way or anything like that. But it is something that maybe would turn people who were looking online specifically to avoid tax before, it might turn them to a store in a situation where they wouldn't have before. So it's a good thing. I mean, it's fair, right? It levels the playing field, and it takes away one of those obstacles that they have to deal with in what is a very trying time for those, physical retailers.
Yeah. And then also going back to another topic, Amazon. From what I understand, sellers who use fulfillment by Amazon are in an especially tricky situation. What is FBA and how does it factor into this situation?
Yeah, so fulfillment by Amazon is something that's been around for a while, I think 10 plus years at this point. And basically it's a service that you pay Amazon for. You send your inventory to an Amazon warehouse or an Amazon facility of some kind, and they store that inventory for you, and they send out those orders whenever someone buys something. So basically they're serving as what's called a third-party logistics provider, or 3PL. They're handling everything for you aside from the sale of the product and stuff like that. So once an order comes in, they're going to have that inventory stored for you, so you don't need to have your own warehouse. And probably the even bigger part of it is they're going to send it out for you, which can be a big headache when it comes to figuring out the best way to send things, the most cost-efficient way, while still getting it there in a time window that's acceptable for the customer. So it's a super, super popular program. And with how popular Amazon is, I think it's something like 40% of all e-commerce in the US is through Amazon. It's a huge source of Amazon's a huge source of revenue for so many companies, and a lot of those companies use fulfillment by Amazon because either it's not worth the money or it's not worth the headache of them having their whole own logistics operations. So the tricky thing here, and this is something I wasn't aware of until I spoke to a tax expert, and something he presented to me was that Amazon will move your inventory around, and it has warehouses all over the United States, I think in over 30 states. And it'll move your inventory around once they have it without you really knowing, simply because it makes sense for them to have the inventory as close to the customer as possible. So if you're selling sunglasses and they're doing really well in Florida and California, then they're going to try to keep inventory as close to Florida and California as they can. Maybe not all of it, obviously, but a good chunk of it.
Does that mean that you have a physical nexus then?
Yeah, that's exactly the problem. Again, this does not even relate to the Wayfair decision. So this is something companies, it's been a problem for companies for a while now, but a lot of them are just unaware of it. But yeah, that's giving them a physical nexus by a lot of state standards, at least, if they're keeping inventory in those states. And we have actually seen several states, according to this attorney I talked to, who has firsthand examples of California, Pennsylvania, Washington State, and I think there were a couple others who were actively pursuing back taxes from the Amazon inventory, or from the inventory from X company that Amazon was keeping in their state.
Wow.
So that's a whole nother wrinkle, and something that's been going on for a little while, even before the Wayfair decision. I would say these back taxes, were something that some companies were hearing about back in 2018, maybe even 2017, before the Wayfair decision. But I think that maybe there's just a little bit more awareness around it right now because there's so much talk about e-commerce taxes and Amazon. So this kind of rose to the surface, but a pretty big issue. And yeah, I mean, you could end up owing hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not more, in those states.
We interrupt this podcast episode with a word from our sponsors over at Blue Mics. Everyone has a story to tell, and if you're a storyteller, you probably know Blue Mics for their iconic Yeti microphone, which has helped millions of people find and amplify their voices. If you're thinking about creating your own podcast, recording some voiceovers, gaming, reading audiobooks, or what have you, then you need to check out Blue's new Yeti Caster, the complete mic and boom arm system ready to connect to your laptop, bringing the ultimate broadcast studio setup to your home or office. That's what we use here at the NetSuite Studios, and we really love recording with them. To get your hands on one of these setups, visit bluedesigns.com and use code PODCAST at checkout for a special price.
So with all of this, I mean, with the Wayfair decision, with, everything that's going on with Amazon, what would your advice be for businesses that are looking at all of their sales, across all of these states and trying to figure out how to comply and trying to make sure that, they're more aware of where their inventory is going if they're being fulfilled by Amazon and so on and so forth? What advice to it? This is a lot.
Yeah.
If I was a retailer right now listening to this, I would be a little, stressed out just thinking about it, even if I was already aware of it. So what's your advice?
Yeah, so I think, you should start with kind of what we talked about before, which is getting a tax expert to do what's called a nexus analysis for you. And that's where they'll determine where you have physical nexus, first of all, and then where you have economic nexus under the laws in each state. And then they should be able to help you prioritize states a little bit, because they're going to be very familiar with what states are really, looking for that money, honestly. They're going to know what states are not really letting their foot off the pedal and which ones are a little bit. I do think there's a little bit of a grace period with these new economic nexus laws where it's, there's an understanding that it's going to take a little bit of time to get ramped up, but also we're almost a year from that decision. So, how much time are they really going to give you to get this figured out? It's like at some point you're just ignoring it.
Exactly.
But yeah, those are the first steps, and then after that is really when you need some sort of tax automation solution if you're doing a substantial amount of business.
Yeah, because even if you bring a tax expert in and you don't have the data collected in one spot for them, how are they going to be able to do their jobs?
Right. I think it starts with an ERP and accounting system like a NetSuite that can keep all your data in kind of a unified place, and it might also integrate with your e-commerce site. Like SuiteCommerce for NetSuite is an e-commerce platform that is part of the NetSuite solution. So all those online orders, all that customer information for people ordering from your site, it's all feeding into one place, and it's very easy to get reporting and stuff on that. But I really think when it comes to taxes, NetSuite alone isn't going to address all your problems. That's really when you need to find a partner that specializes in what's called tax automation.
Yeah.
And that will integrate with your financial system and with your e-commerce system to kind of turn this all into an automated process that hopefully eventually becomes something that takes care of itself and isn't something that you're worried about every day. Am I collecting taxes? Am I collecting the right amount? So these tax solutions, are pretty advanced systems because, for example, here in Colorado, we have an extremely complex tax system where there's different taxes based on counties and cities. And, the city of Denver has like a cultural improvement tax, which you're not going to find in a suburb and so forth. So it's so complicated. Different goods are taxed at different rates in some states. Like clothing could be taxed differently than alcohol, which could be taxed differently than a piece of electronic equipment. So the tax automation solution should be able to account for all that, the type of good, the customer's location, and that location being not just their state, right, but also where exactly they are in that state in terms of city and county, and automatically spit out a number of you need to pay, $9.53 in tax on this order. And then it should also, the tax automation solution should also not only calculate that tax and make sure the customer pays it, but then it will remit that money to the state on whatever basis they need it. Different states, I think, have different periods for how often you have to file those returns. Some of them are like monthly or quarterly. Some of them are less frequent than that, but it should, handle all of that for you. And that's really a necessity if you're a business of a decent size that's hitting these thresholds in more than a few states.
Wow. So much to unpack here. So I want to talk about NetSuite. What role does NetSuite and how has NetSuite partnered with companies to help businesses comply with these laws?
Yeah. So, NetSuite is that centralized data hub, if you will, and that's where it all starts. That's where all the revenue information and order information is. But then, you have your tax automation providers, and NetSuite has several partners. Avalara is probably the biggest company out there that does tax automation, and I'm sure business is going quite well for them right now since this decision came down. There's there's another company called TaxJar who does something similar, and I think we have a handful of other partners who can also help you. But this is almost mandatory for most companies out there unless you're a really small business and you can handle this on more of a case-by-case basis and you're only paying taxes to a couple states. But, at some point you're going to have to potentially hire someone, whether it's just someone outside, like an attorney or a consultant, or it's like an actual full-time employee. And that's when an automated solution, like with so many other aspects of your business, can be really a better financial choice than hiring someone. And not only that, but when everything's automated, much less room for error, right? So that's always good. But yeah, hopefully if you have NetSuite and you have a tax automation solution integrated into NetSuite, everything will kind of take care of itself. At least that's the idea.
Well, something tells me this isn't it, though. How could these laws change and evolve in the years to come?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, so much has changed in 10 months. And when this decision first came down, and then when you look at what's changed in the last 10 months since the decision, it's crazy. And we've already seen some states actually modify their laws. So they instituted laws and then changed them. Washington State, for example, got rid of their transaction threshold, and it's just a revenue threshold now. So that's one example of that. But there are a handful of states that kind of made an adjustment on the fly, if you will. And I think we could see more of that because, like we talked about earlier, it doesn't seem fair for some of these states to have such low limits. And so that's something we could see challenged, and it's something states could change their laws on based on how that all kind of goes down and how much resistance they face from businesses. So that's one thing to look out for. And then, as I also mentioned, there's several states that have active legislation on this very issue, and I'm sure some of them are going to go through. So I think we're going to get closer and closer to those 45 states having sales tax laws probably pretty soon. I mean, there could be like one or two holdouts for a while for one reason or another. But I think this is just too good of an opportunity for states to collect tax money that they can use for, all these things they need to do.
Right.
And so I think they'd kind of be dumb to not take advantage of it now that the Supreme Court ruled in favor of South Dakota in that decision.
How can NetSuite prepare businesses to handle, any of these changing laws moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think NetSuite's always looking for creative ways to adapt to whatever the business challenges of the day are. And in this case, e-commerce taxes are a really, really significant issue for a lot of our customers and for just a lot of businesses of all sizes out there. So I think it is something that NetSuite is putting an emphasis on trying to help with. And some of the features that, they could potentially put out there is better reporting capabilities that are more focused specifically on taxes, maybe something that would give you a really easy picture of whether you're meeting the threshold in a certain state or not. But on top of that, once you have a tax automation solution integrated, it should be auto-updating as these laws change. Like I said, there's been so much change in 10 months, and I don't see that really slowing down. I think they could continue to change. And so the tax people are really going to be the ones, I think, at the forefront of that, making sure their solution is always up to date with whatever the latest is, since it's such a dynamic issue.
Got it. So the things that I learned here today, basically, be aware of these laws, get a tax expert to help you become aware of these laws, have a business solution and a tax automation solution to help you track that data, not only track your sales and everything else, but also track the data in terms of what's changing in different states and what, is being charged for sales tax, like you said, in clothing versus alcohol versus whatever else. Would you say that's a good summary?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the key thing here is ignorance is not an excuse. You can't just...
Ignorance is not bliss.
Right. You can't just hope that, maybe they won't find me, or, this really isn't something I want to deal with right now. I have way too much stuff going on, so we'll just figure it out later. I understand that, business owners and really anyone that works for a smaller business has a ton on their plate, but this is really something I think people need to prioritize, because if they come calling for that money and it's a large amount of money and you don't have it, that's a big problem, because you have to think when you get hit with back taxes, you never collected the money in the first place.
Right.
So it's just coming out of your pockets. Taxes are something where, yes, it might be a disadvantage in the sense that you lose the consumer a little bit because they don't want to pay tax money, but they're the one footing the bill.
Right.
Ideally is how this is supposed to work. You just have to worry about compliance and making sure you're charging it. But if you never charged it, and they say, well, you owe us $300,000. I mean, that could sink some businesses or at least put a major dent in them. And that's why I think this is really something that you have to pay attention to now. It is a pretty urgent issue because it can have such a big impact on the health and survival of your business.
Right. Well, and customers should be privy to it at this point if everybody else is doing it and they're, whether they're in a brick and mortar store or they're shopping online.
Right.
They're going to get hit with it.
Right.
So if you're not doing it, it's kind of going to stick out a little bit.
Exactly. And I kind of think it was a thing of the past to be able to go online and avoid taxes because big retailers were already collecting taxes and it's just kind of inevitable, right? Like this is
this is the
fair.
world. Yeah, exactly. It's the world we live in. Well, thank you so much, Ian, for joining us on this episode of the NetSuite podcast. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure we'll be learning more as these laws continue to change and unfold before us.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks for having me on, Kendall.
And with that, I'll leave a bit of food for thought. How are you handling these changing tax laws and regulations? Thank you so much to Ian McHugh for joining us on this episode of the NetSuite podcast. We also want to thank our editors over at Lampstand, and as always, all you listeners for tuning in. Don't forget, rate, review, and subscribe. See ya!
You just listened to the NetSuite podcast. Be sure to tune in every week with more NetSuite developments, stories, and insights into the benefits of one integrated system to help you run your business.